Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is going to be the second podcast of the Meridian Review podcast. And tonight, what I want to talk about, or this morning or afternoon, depending on when this finishes uploading tomorrow, is the fact that language matters. What do I mean by that? When we talk about language now, when we talk about the words that we use to communicate meaning between each other, I think a lot of times, and I think this is especially the case in modern academia and just in the modern culture and context, we don't think of language as being something that is all that objective. We think of language as being a series of sounds or a series of words that have evolved over time that just happen to have meaning ascribed to them so that you and I can transfer the meaning that we have come up with in our minds to one another. And that is all that language is. And on one level, that is true. We create words all the time. Languages do evolve and have evolved over thousands of years. I've heard it said once by a linguist that at least in more ancient times, the language that one generation was speaking was a language that would be completely undecipherable by only two generations later in the exact same place under the exact same language that was being used. I don't know if that is exactly true, but it is very true that as English speakers, you would be hard-pressed to find someone who could understand exactly the meaning that someone like Chaucer was trying to communicate through Middle English when he wrote his Canterbury Tales, let alone someone like the author of Beowulf was trying to communicate in his poem in Old English, something that would be closer to modern-day German than it actually would be to modern-day English. And yet that is the ancestral tongue that all English speakers have. That all being said, as we sit down to discuss language, I think it is important that we start to think about language theologically, because language is not something that humans actually created. If you are a Christian, you believe that language is a gift from God. You do not think, or at least I don't imagine that you can think, that Adam and Eve were created without the capacity, without linguistic capacity. God supernaturally revealed or supernaturally embedded language within the minds of his creatures so that he could communicate with them. Now, at that time, the language that they used would have been something that was completely and totally dictated by God. The words that they used did not have a subjective kind of meaning, a meaning that was more dependent on they who heard the words, which is closer to how we think of language, especially post-Derrida and post-deconstructionist understanding of language. But all meanings, as all things were and are, but at least were understood at that time by both Adam and Eve and God, everything was understood to have a meaning set in God, that God defined the meaning of all that was, and language is under that category. Every single word that they would have used had its meaning lodged and its interpretation lodged in the God of the universe, and the God that was sustaining their every breath and had commanded them to live in such a way as to maintain the garden, not eat of the tree, etc. And so as we think of language, I think it's important that we take a step back as Christians to ask, where does this language come from? Language is not a human construct per se. I believe more so, it is a godly construct that has been marred by sin, that has been changed over time because of our own subjectivity, of our own desire to interpret things as we see fit and not interpret things as God has ordained it. And we can see this as we continue through the scriptural narrative, right? As we go from Adam and Eve in the garden, as they started out only being able to interpret everything around them and interpret all the words that they were able to use by how God said that they ought to interpret it. They come to a point when the devil, when the serpent comes to them to tempt them and asks the following question: did God really say? The devil is, in essence, trying to have Adam and Eve, specifically Eve in this part of the story, take a step back and not interpret everything as God has ordained it, or ordained these things to be interpreted, but has said, how do you know what God is saying is true? And for that matter, how do you know what I, the devil, am saying is true? Why don't you weigh these options in your own mind and interpret for yourself who is being more truthful? And oh, by the way, God is afraid that you may become as powerful as he. He gives that kind of that last line to attempt to show Eve, if you're going to judge for yourself what the world around you means, if you're going to judge for yourself who is right, I or God, let me just remind you that God is just some power-hungry maniac who wants to hoard all his power to himself and doesn't want you to accrue any power that would make you closer in status to God. And of course, as soon as Eve took a step back and made herself the judge, made herself the reference point for how she ought to interpret the world, she began to interpret things wrongly. And this is one of, if not the major problem with sinful man, is that we do not choose to make God the reference point. We make ourselves the reference point. When we speak of morality, when we speak of language, when we speak of reality, what is truth, what is not truth, some people even disregard the concept of truth entirely. All of this stems from not wanting a starting point, not wanting a reference point outside of ourselves, and wanting ourselves to be the reference, wanting ourselves to define what is good, what is evil, what is right, what is wrong, and what do words mean. And I think as we begin to develop a theory of language, what is language, how ought we to think about it, how ought we to use it, we have to start here. At the very least, we have to start with God. How does he view language? How does he tell us to view language through his special revelation of the scriptures, which, by the way, is written in human language, two common tongues of the day. And obviously both the Hebrew and Greek were not free from the sinful evolution, or not so sinful evolution, sometimes just natural evolution, however we want to talk about this, and I'm not here to dive into deep linguistic theory. But God chose in his providence to use the languages of the common people that he was speaking to at the time, whether it be the Hebrews in the 2nd and 1st century BC, or the 1st century Jews of the Roman Empire. And so I do not want to discount the fact that he has used human language, but at the same time, as we think about language in general, as we think about linguistic evolution, as we think about all of these things, we have to, I believe, realize that language originates in God. It does not originate in man. God gave us language to begin with. He also chose to confuse language later on in Genesis. And as such, we have to think through language and I don't want to come across as saying that language is entirely objective, but we have to agree that there is a level of objectivity to it. All that being said, this brings me to an interesting discussion that I had with a very dear friend of mine. And that discussion revolves around words that did not exist until the last century. And those are the words of feminism and environmentalism. Now, these are two words that designate movements that have cropped up in the 20th century. Movements that I would not identify with or consider myself to be a part of. And yet, my friend told me that he, in one sense, would say that he could, as a Christian, and I want to preface very clearly that he is a very strong, dear Christian brother. And so he and I are as close as brothers. We talk through philosophy and theology for hours and hours on end. So we were just kind of going through this kind of thought experiment. And he said that he believed that he could, as a conservative, Reformed Christian, identify as a feminist if he was allowed to define what feminist meant to him. Or maybe not necessarily to him. Feminism, he said, had started out merely as a movement that desired the equality between men and women before the law. And if that's really the definition of feminism, if that's all that it is, then I don't think that there are many Christians who would disagree with such a notion. He also applied this to environmentalism. He said, if environmentalism merely is a movement that seeks to treat the earth well, then he, as a conservative, Reformed Christian, would agree with that. And I don't think that I know any conservative, Reformed Christians, or any Christians for that matter, that would disagree with that. But something didn't sit right with me as I was thinking through the way that he said this. Can or should a conservative Christian identify with feminism or environmentalism? But I think feminism is a more blatant movement to think on. And I don't know if we can. And this comes to, and I'm not sure if I can, I think it was Noam Chomsky, and I don't advocate almost any of his views. I believe he's quite anarchist in the way that he views the world and he views language and all of that. And I don't think he's Christian in the slightest. But if what I've heard is true, he was the one that said that as a movement, if we are going to try to create a movement, to be the most successful you can be, it is best to define your movement, to define your slogan or whatever phrase you're going to insert into the modern culture. That it be a phrase, or be a slogan, or be a definition that no one can disagree with. And you see where I'm going here with this, that if you're someone who is advocating for feminism, whatever that may mean, whatever it may mean to you, what the public needs to see is that it means something that they can agree with. Because then you and your movement, and your organization will gain support. So, as a Christian, yes, I will have to agree with how feminists or environmentalists or any of these movements who have cleverly crafted a designation or a definition for their movement, I'll have to agree with that definition because they have intentionally crafted it such that I will agree with it. And yet, as I pay credence to, as I agree with those sentiments, those definitions, I'm going to come to a place where, while I may still be Christian, I am, at the very least, ignorantly supporting a movement that outright blames Christianity for the position of women, for the oppression of women, for all of these things that once you start researching what's going on, especially in what we want to call third wave feminism, and I'm no expert in feminism, I couldn't tell you the exact demarcations between the three waves. I can tell you that I disagree with them more and more as they become more progressed. But if you're going around calling yourself a feminist, that is popular support that feminists will be looking for. And if you are thinking back to how I talked in the last episode, I think you'll know exactly where I'm going with this. Today, there is a particular organization that has not only co-opted a term or a newly created term or a definition, but an entire phrase that on its head no one can disagree with. And that is that Black Lives Matter. And of course, I don't think that any conservative Christian, anyone who honestly reads the scriptures at all, can disagree with. We see in the beginning of Genesis the first mention in the very first chapter of Genesis of the Imago Dei, the image of God. It is this notion that Christian ethicists and Christian political theorists and Christian philosophers have clung to when we speak of the notion that all men are worthy of at least some kind of dignity, of at least some kind of respect. And I think that is very well stated in the Declaration of Independence when Thomas Jefferson says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights." The notion that all men, having been created in the image of God, in the Imago Dei, have something from God that makes them set apart from the rest of creation, that makes them something that God called very good when he created it. And so in that sense, when we think of the statement, Black Lives Matter, any Christian in his right mind would say, of course, all lives matter. Any human life has inherent meaning and value and purpose because it is the God of the universe that created it. He does nothing by mistake. And he created that person embedded with his own image, however marred it is by sin. But as we think through what Black Lives Matter stands for, we have to ask ourselves, what do they mean by these words? Because I can guarantee you as Christians, we mean something different. As Christians, it's easy to say that Black Lives Matter because they do, because they are created by God. But what does BLM mean by this? In their interpretation of the world, in their Marxist outlook on life, and I say that quite honestly, they themselves claim that they are trained Marxists. Their leaders do. And Marxism is an ideology that assumes certain things about the world. It assumes that this world is godless. It assumes that religion is an opiate of the masses. It was always and ever used by those who are in power to dupe those who have no power. And so all things must have a natural, a materialistic explanation. So in essence, we are just atoms floating through the air, molecules randomly pieced together. And so when we think of what the word matter means, not just matter in space, but the word in Black Lives Matter, the word matter, what does that mean to someone who thinks that all things must have an entirely natural explanation? An explanation that has no root in God, has no root in the supernatural. That human beings simply exist by accident. How can then, what does matter mean to a person that thinks that? I would argue they have no basis for meaning of a word like matter. There is no purpose to something that is accidental. That is the very definition of what it means to be accidental. It happened by mistake. It happened without a purpose. And so it does not matter. As a Christian, I believe that God is sovereign over all things, that there is no such thing as a mistake, that even a child born as a mistake, as unexpected chance may have it, that it was not entirely unexpected that this child would come. That God, in his sovereignty, not only foresaw it coming, but created all the opportunities for it to come. And so through the mistake of mother or father or both, God still intended for it to come and has a purpose for that child. So I can, as a Christian, honestly say that it matters, but as someone who only believes that chance brought us here, how can we say that any of us, any of our lives matter in the slightest? That's a question that I still have not found a satisfactory answer from any of the materialistic side, be they Marxist or atheist or agnostic. And so, as we consider trained Marxists, as they call themselves, chanting Black Lives Matter to us, we have to think through the presuppositions that we hold and the presuppositions that they hold, and realize that they're not saying the same things that we're saying when we say those exact same words. Black lives to Christians do matter because they have a purpose from God. A Marxist borrows that meaning kind of to make you feel morally guilty or morally culpable so that you might join them on their side, join them in support, at the very least support them as they burn down Western society, which to them is fairly synonymous with Christian society. But that's not where we stop when we think about this simple 3-word phrase. Because as a Christian, when they say Black lives, I think that I mean something different than they mean as well. When they say Black lives, they mean those who are black who were killed by white police officers. As a Christian, I would like to add the word unjustly in there. Of course, as a Christian, I also have a standard of justice to look to that is apparent in the scriptures given by God. And as such, I believe that when anyone, be they black or white or brown or yellow or orange or any color, if they are killed unjustly, we call that murder. And there is a single penalty that the scriptures offer for murder, and that is death. But I don't think that that's what they mean when they say Black lives. They see Black lives being killed by police officers, specifically white police officers, as indicative of a system that is racist towards Black Americans or Black non-Americans, however they want their narrative to shift. And so as soon as a Black person is killed by a white cop, it doesn't matter if it's just or unjust, whether that Black person is helpless on the ground with the knee of a white police officer to his neck, which I don't know anyone who thinks that that was just in the slightest, or that person was reaching inside of the police officer's car to grab their weapon, and then when the police officer steps out of the car, that person charges them, this 6'5" person. And I'm speaking of the young man at Ferguson that started off this entire cultural shift and movement. Both of those people to the Black Lives Matter community are equally victims, though one was shot, and I would say in legitimate self-defense, and one was killed in a horrifically unjust manner, regardless of the drugs that he had on him or what was happening. I do not believe, and I have not been shown that George Floyd did anything worthy of death, especially death before judgment in a court. of his peers. And so, and it matters little as well whether any of these officers did this out of a racist motivation. And it matters little to the Bible as well. If they were committing this crime unjustly, they ought to be prosecuted as such. But to the Black Lives Matter movement, the individual matters very little, and the individual motivation matters very little. For what they see is a system of racist oppression towards Black lives. But as I will talk about in a second, only specific Black lives. And the individual facts matter very little. I know many who have continued to speak about the hands up narrative, the narrative of the black man at Ferguson whose name is escaping me, said hands up, don't shoot, and the police shot him anyways. That has been debunked. That never happened. And yet, that was the basis for the entire movement's conception. And yet, many have gone on record saying that it doesn't matter, that is a lie, that wasn't the specific facts of what went on. What they see is a system. And regardless of what facts you can bring to the table to prove individual circumstances that might build up that system, the system is there in their mind, and you trying to bring facts to disprove it just proves that you're part of that system. And this system is against Black lives, therefore, if you're for the system, you're against Black lives. And so many people, Christians included, have folded, essentially. Why would you fight the mob when you realize that it could mean so much hatred from this side or that, from employers, from friends, from anyone? And I understand. But when someone says to me, or would say to me, do Black Lives Matter? I've realized that as a Christian, what I should be saying is yes, all Black lives matter. As a Christian, I believe that all Black lives killed unjustly should have justice done for them, should have the long arm of the law, the government whom God placed as his authority here on earth, do justice for them through the power of the sword, the power of the gun, as it were, or the noose, or the electric chair, or I guess injection now. But when I say that all Black Lives Matter, I do not just mean George Floyd, though I do mean him, and his killers should be brought to justice. But I also mean the hundreds, if not thousands, of Black lives that have been killed by shooting in the streets by white or black members of gangs, criminals, drug dealers, thugs of any kind, really. Crimes that happen all the time. I also mean something that the left can never get behind. The thousands and millions of infants that are not yet born who are killed and mutilated. Abortion affects Black lives disproportionately. Why? not just because of the welfare system that has put many, many mothers or expecting mothers in terrible dependent situations in which they feel that they have no other choice, but for the fact that Planned Parenthood was created by Margaret Sanger, who had ties to the KKK and who had a strong belief in the same kind of eugenic notions that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party had. So much so that she started an organization that could eliminate the black populace from this country, she thought. And as I see many, many statues of brave men who fought for this country, many of whom fought for the abolition of slavery so that black men and women could be free. And yet I still see black people in BLM and any of these organizations calling for more money to Planned Parenthood and keeping Planned Parenthood and abortion clinics open. It is very, very hard for me to continue to respect these movements at all in any sense. Millions of babies are still killed here in the United States by an organization that was started by someone who was a eugenicist, who wanted to see the African American population eliminated. Yet why do we not cancel Planned Parenthood? Why do we cancel Lin-Manuel Miranda, who has historically been one of the most outspoken left-wing public figures, who diversified the cast of Hamilton for the very purpose of showing the part that African Americans have played in U.S. history. And yet that is worthy of cancellation more than Planned Parenthood, which was started to destroy black lives. It baffles the mind to even think about that. And as a Christian, it pains the heart. Church, where are we when it comes to abortion? Where are we when it comes to stopping this great sin? And I'm not saying that the church has not done a lot already, but that sin alone makes us worthy of the fires that rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah. We kill infants in the womb or out of the womb in post-birth abortions in some places. And not only is it legal, but Supreme Court case after Supreme Court case and law after law are passed to protect its legality and protect the easy access that people have to it. If you are not aware, the Supreme Court recently ruled that doctors in abortion clinics do not have to have admit privileges to the local hospital. this is not to mention that this is just a common sense or even feminist idea, because many women may have medical issues when they are going through these operations. And so a doctor needs to be able to get this woman to a hospital as quickly as possible. And yet our Supreme Court has decided, with the deciding voice of Mr. John Roberts, that no, that's oppressive, that is counter to our Constitution, which is ridiculous. None of our founders or writers of the Constitution or any of the amendments therein had abortion in mind when they wrote what they wrote. And yet, no, John Roberts and the others say, according to the Constitution, according to, and this, we're going to bring this around full circle, according to the meaning that is imparted to us by the document that is the Constitution, it is against the God-given rights of man to pass a law that would actually protect the health of a woman seeking an abortion, because it might make it harder for the woman to have said abortion. And this is where we have to come back, right? We see how BLM does not define either Black lives or matter in the same way that we as Christians do. That when we say that, we mean something different. We mean something about the Imago Dei. They mean something about America in general, how it is an oppressive system, and how this notion, if they can get us to believe it, will further their Marxist revolution. And make no mistake, that is what they're after. And as we talk about this, I know that I'm sounding more and more subjective in the way that I use language. But as Christians, I think we have to be very careful with the way that we use language. We have to think about it both in the objective sense, in that words have meaning. We ought to seek as best as we can to use the meaning that is ascribed to those words, but also understand that our words impart meaning to other people that may not be the same meaning that we know them or believe them to have. And so, in one sense, we have to both be careful when we just throw around the phrase Black Lives Matter, because as Christians, that means something different to us than it means to the world. And at the same time, we have to be aware of others in the way that they use language. And I think a great example of this is the church that was turning toward liberalism at the beginning of the 20th century. When pastors were coming into the Presbyterian church, the main Presbyterian church of the early 20th century, which is the PCUSA today, they would be asked a series of questions on the floor of presbytery to make sure that they fell in line with Orthodox Reformed Christian teaching. And one of these questions is easy for any Christian, any real Christian to answer, and that is, do you believe in the resurrection? And many pastors, with a smile on their face, said, yes, of course, I believe in the resurrection. But as liberal scholarship had progressed in the 19th century, and as many big name scholars had done work in the area of theology, the word resurrection started to mean something different. It had a subjective flair. If you ask Karl Barth, it had a almost external dimension flair about it, that the resurrection was something that happened outside this dimension of time and space. And so the meaning of the word was twisted so that these men could gain position and corrupt the Presbyterian Church from the inside, which of course they did. And now the largest Presbyterian denomination in the United States, the PCUSA, is abjectly heretical. Long has it been since it could ever have been called Reformed, but it has abandoned doctrines that are essential to any Christian faith at all. And so as Christians, we have to beware both how we use language towards others and how they use language towards us. And be aware of the fact that language originates in God, but is twisted by sinful man. And I do not exclude myself from that category. As Christians, we still sin day in and day out. But as much as we can, we should aspire to the ideal of an objective form of language. And this comes back to the way that we view the founding documents, the way that we view the Constitution, the way that we view the amendments to the Constitution. Because if I'm ruling on what constitutionality, if that's for lack of a better term, how constitutional a law is, I'm going to judge it based off of how I believe the writer of the Constitution intended his words to come across. For me to do anything different, I think would be dishonest. If I am writing a note to someone and he intentionally takes the words to mean something that he doesn't think that I actually meant, that is totally dishonest. It is morally wrong. Because if he could make the words mean whatever he wants them to mean, what's the point in me writing the letter in the first place? To take words intentionally out of context is a breach of the 9th commandment. As much as it is to construe your words in such a way that they will be taken out of context by those who are listening. It goes both ways. And so, as we think about language, we have to think not only back to the objectiveness that they have as rooted in God, but in the moral factor that it has as it is tied to the moral law of God. We are called to be honest. We are called not to bear false witness, both in the way that we use our language and the way that we think about and interpret and speak of others' language. And so that's what I'll leave you with today as we think about everything that's going on, because the secular culture uses words in different meanings all the time, and they create new words all the time. And so think about that as we go forward. When you use language like Black Lives Matter, how is that being interpreted? And when Black Lives Matter use words that seem vaguely Christian, how are they using them? We have to be objective. Objective by the Word of God, because the Word of God comes from the God of the universe, the one who interprets all things, by whom all things are to be interpreted, because anything that is interpreted by anything less is not really being interpreted at all. It is being marred in dishonesty and lies. And that is something that the Prince of Lies is oh so good at. So, and as far as it is up to you, be honest this week, this month, this year. Think through the language you use. Think carefully. Use loving language. Use honest language. Don't mar your brother and sister. Don't mar your enemy in dishonesty. As we attack our opponents, we try to be honest on the views that they hold. Sometimes even making them stronger than they are, so that we can then show the even more powerful stance that we have in Christ, in truth, in justice. Because none of these things mean anything. None of these things have any interpretation if they don't have it in Christ. So as you go about your time, consider these things, dear brothers and sisters. It has been a pleasure. The Lord bless you and keep you, and I will see you next time. This is Caleb Maltby signing out.